Thank you. I've never seen somebody ask everybody to introduce themselves before the program. That was gutsy. I imagine 80 or 90 arguments were started just in those 4 seconds. It's a pleasure to be back here at the JCC of San Francisco. I've been here several times, and it feels like coming to my San Francisco home. Having been here a few times, I know I should be brief. I know a lot of you are Jewish. You didn't come here to hear me speak. You came here to hear yourselves speak. And so I'll try to get myself out of the way. But before I amble off, I thought I'd tell 2 stories. And there are 2 stories nominally about myself, but I hope about a lot of people. And one is the outward story, the story we tell about our lives, about the external things we do in our lives. And the second is the internal story, what's actually going on inside while those external events were happening. And so my external story is pretty straightforward. I grew up on the Lower East Side of New York. If you start at 14th Street and walk south for about a half a mile, you would pass where my great-grandfather had a kosher butcher shop, where my grandfather had a law firm, where my mother and father grew up, where I grew up, and where my son is now in college. So that's 5 generations in one spot. And I grew up in the 60s and 70s as someone left-wing era in Greenwich Village. My parents, when I was 5, took me to what they called, the hippies called a be-in, where they would go to be. And one of the things they did was they set a garbage can on fire and they threw their wallets into it to demonstrate how little they cared about money. And I was 5 and I broke from the crowd, reached into the garbage can, pulled out a $5 bill and ran away. And that was my first step over to the right. And then when I was 7, I read a book called Paddington the Bear. And I decided at that moment I wanted to become a writer. And I've been writing pretty much every day since. I remember in high school I wanted to date this woman named Bernice. She didn't want to date me. She wanted to date some other guy. And I remember thinking, what is she thinking? I write way better than that guy. But we had different values. And so already I was kind of cerebral, writerly. When I was 18, the admissions officers at Columbia University, Wesleyan and Brown decided I should go to the University of Chicago. The obsolete saying about Chicago is it's where fun goes to die, but the best saying about Chicago is it's a Baptist school where atheist professors teach Jewish students St. Thomas Aquinas. So and so I was pretty cerebral at Chicago. I had a double major in history and celibacy while I was there. And actually had the big break of my life. It's a true story. William F. Buckley came to campus, and I wrote a parody of him for being a name-dropping blowhard. I said, at Yale, he created 2 magazines, one called the National Buckley, one called the Buckley Review, which he merged to form the Buckley, and and at the end of the speech, he said to the student body, David Brooks, if you're in the audience, I want to give you a job. So he apparently liked the piece. And that was like the big break of my life. Sadly, I wasn't in the audience. This is also true. I was, I think on Nob Hill here, I'd been hired by PBS to debate Milton Friedman about economics. It was a TV show called, it was called Tyranny of the Status Quo, but it was Milton Friedman talking to 6 college students from around the country. And I was then in my, actually you can go on YouTube and see it. If you YouTube David Brooks, Milton Friedman, you'll see a 21-year-old me with a big Jew fro and these gigantic 1980s glasses, which were apparently on loan from the Mount Palomar Lunar Observatory. They were these gigantic things. And the show is basically me regurgitating something I'd read in a textbook, Friedman destroying it in about 6 words, and then me sitting there with my mouth hanging open trying to think of something to say. That's the show. And so I did that and eventually called Buckley and said, is that job offer still open? He said, yes. And so that was my break. And then I went on and had job after job. I went to the Wall Street Journal, where I worked with a bunch of Midwestern farm boys. A lot of my colleagues were Indiana, from Iowa, farmers. And for a guy who grew up in New York in a Jewish household, it was, they had they were comfortable with silence. And, and I always say that a Shabbat meal is 18 people around a table, all talking at once, correcting the other 17 wrong things that they've heard everyone else say. So this was a different culture, and our meetings had these long silences. It was like going to an open casket funeral with 12 bodies around. And I would just sit there staring and say, I will not break this silence, I will not break this silence. And so that was, you meet new people, and then eventually I got a job at the New York Times. I was a conservative columnist at the New York Times, which is a job I likened to being the chief rabbi at Mecca. Not a lot of company there. And then I got this job at the NewsHour. I worked with a guy named Mark Shields. We have a segment called Shields and Brooks. We wanted to call it Brooks Shields. That would have been better, but they didn't go for that. And I always say that Mark is a little older than me, a significant chunk, and he's been doing it a little while. Our segment is called Shields and Brooks and has been since 2001. Before that, it was Shields and Shigo. Before that, it was Shields and Gergen. Before that, it was Shields and Coolidge. And I think it's Shields and John Adams, I think it started as. And we cater to a certain demographic in many places, what we call seasoned youth. And so if a 93-year-old lady comes up to me in the airport, I know what she's going to say. I don't watch your show, but my mother loves it. And so that's also kind of a cerebral part of my life. NewsHour for TV is cerebral. And then books are central to my life. I read a ton of books. I think my tastes have gotten more feminine as I've gotten older. I'm the only American man to finish that book, Eat, Pray, Love. By page 123, I was actually lactating, which was amazing. And then I wrote this book on character called The Road to Character. And I learned writing a book about character doesn't actually give you good character. And even reading a book on character doesn't give you good character. But buying a book on character does give you good character. So I recommend that. And so that's one version, this exterior version of my life. Now let me tell you the interior version, which is about what's going on in a lot of our lives. So first, I went back and reread Paddington the Bear a year ago, and I was stunned by it. First of all, it's really sad. It's about this bear who grows up in Peru and is stranded in a London train station and has nobody. And then suddenly a family takes him in, he has people to love him. And as I read it, I was thinking, what kind of kid was I that this really appealed to? And then I remember the intensity of reading that book, and I remember the intensity I felt at the time of wanting to do this, of wanting to be a writer. And there are certain moments that a lot of us have in the course of our lives that I've come to think of as annunciation moments, moments early in life, or maybe later, that prefigure a lot of what's going to come last. When something really strikes us deeply, and we end up doing a lot the rest of our lives sort of in that thing. One of my heroes is a guy named E.O. Wilson, who's a great scientist. When he was 7, he was living in Alabama, and his parents were divorcing. They sent him away to a beach in Florida to stay with a family he did not know. And he didn't know the family, so he spent that whole summer just walking along the beach. And he'd never been to an ocean before. And so he saw fish and creatures that were beyond the scope of his imagination. Imagine never seeing a jellyfish, and suddenly there's a jellyfish. One day he was sitting on the dock, and a stingray slid beneath his feet in the water. And he estimated later on that children see animals at twice the size as adults. And so he was just struck by awe and wonder, and at that moment a naturalist was born. And he's now in his 80s as one of our great scientists. And he says, you just let the child wander around and be curious. And one of the things you notice about that is moments of self-discovery often come as moments of loss. You lose something, and then you find something else. And the other thing you notice about those moments when we find out what we love doing, often they're super aesthetic. So I was mentioning, when you find something that just seems beautiful, and you're called by beauty. My daughter, I was mentioning, when she was 5, she went to an ice hockey rink, and she just felt at home. And now she works for the Anaheim Ducks teaching ice hockey to kids. And she just feels at home in a hockey rink. Einstein, when he was 4, was given a compass. And he noticed the needle moving according to the magnetic pull of the earth, and he thought, wow, there are invisible physical forces in the universe. He thought this at age 4 and spent the rest of his life studying them. Annie Dillard interviewed a painter and asked her, why'd you become a painter? And the painter said, I love the smell of paint. It's just that aesthetic sense. And Wilson had one more moment to his Annunciation moment, which was he was out fishing late in the summer, and he caught a fish, and he was careless taking it off the hook, and it flopped into his eye, and the tail fin poked his retina. And he loved the water so much, even though he was in excruciating pain, he didn't go in, and he ended up losing vision in that eye. And so he couldn't study things that required 2 eyes, like birds or fish, but he could hold up ants to his good eye. And he became an ant scientist and later a broader scientist. And sometimes it's a blessing to have some options closed off. And so that moment of when you discover something, that's part of the intensity of childhood or young adulthood. The second intensity that strikes me from those days is how deep we are capable of admiring others. When I was a kid, teenagers looked like these awesome creatures. They were big and they seemed to have poise. They seemed like godlike to me. And I had mentors like Buckley, and he seemed like an awesome creature I'd very much like to be like when I worked for him. E.O. Wilson had a guy named Philip Darlington, who was a professor at Harvard, and he said to Wilson, when you're collecting your bug samples, don't collect on the trails, cut through the jungle. And one day, Darlington was in the Amazon out on a log collecting some bug samples, and a crocodile came up and grabbed him and pulled him down, and Darlington escaped, and the crocodile came up and grabbed him again, pulled him down. Darlington escaped again, got himself on shore, his right side of his body was shredded, and escaped and got away to a hospital. And that wasn't what impressed Wilson. Anybody can get away from a crocodile. What impressed him was that for the next 6 months, with his body in a cast and his right arm immobilized, he went back out of the jungle and taught himself to collect samples left-handed. And that's something I think we want to be taught when we're young. We don't seek happiness, we seek intensity. And we want to be told that something is hard, but worthy of the hardness. We want a mentor that'll hold up an ideal. A lot of failures in life are caused by just having an inadequate ideal. And we want that high ideal head up something we can really want with all our heart. And so those are the intensities of childhood. And sometimes we do our best to cover over that intensity. We take kids, especially in the privileged classes, who are 15 and 16, and we put them in the middle of the college admissions process, which teaches them that status and achievement are at the center of life. They did a study of junior high school kids. Do your parents care more if you get good grades or more if you're kind? And 80% of the kids said, my parents care more about the grades. So we're in a system. And a lot of us think we're playing the game, but we're really being played by the game. And then we get sucked into the values of our culture. And we live in a culture that's individualistic and it's meritocratic. And there's a lot of good about that culture, but there are some lies embedded in the middle. One is that career success can make you feel fulfilled. And that's not true. I've had more career success than I ever thought I would. And I can tell you, having that career success has made me avoid the bad feelings I might have if I felt myself a failure. But I wouldn't say it's given me any positive fulfillment. And the data is clear that people who make more, earn more, are not happier. Second lie is I can make myself happy. This is the lie of self-sufficiency. If I lose 15 more pounds, if I get really good at yoga, if I win one more victory, I can be happy. But if you talk to people on their deathbed, they talk about relationships, they talk about defeating self-sufficiency and being dependent on others and having them dependent on you. The third thing we learn that's a lie is you can find your own truth. We tell college students, find your own truth, come up with your own values. If your name is Aristotle, maybe you can do that. The rest of us need help. And when we tell that to young people, we're basically saying, find a moral life, but we have no way of knowing what that is. We have nothing to say to you about that. And as a result, a lot of people grow up without moral vocabulary, and my students where I teach, they're hungry for it, they just have not been given the tools of how to think about what's their highest and best life. And then there are all the other lies of the meritocracy. You are what you accomplish. You can earn dignity by attaching yourself to prestigious brands. The emotion of the meritocracy is conditional love. You have to earn your way to get loved, and I see it in my students. Their parents love them, but they're also anxious about them. And when the kid does something the parent thinks will lead to success, the beam of love is strong. When they do something the parent thinks will not lead to success, the beam of love is withdrawn. And the most elemental relationship in their lives is at risk, and they're terrified about it. The anthropology of the meritocracy is that we're not a soul to be saved, we're a set of skills to be maximized. And we pretend it's not the case, but really the judgment of the meritocracy is that people who are smarter and more accomplished are worth slightly more than other people. And so we have this individualism, we have this meritocracy that turns us off a bit into shrewd animals and leaves us a little detached from one another. And to me, most damaging is it turns off the moral switch. You can sometimes look at the world through morally or economically. There was a daycare center in Israel, and they had a problem, which was the parents were coming late to pick up the kids. And so they decided to impose fines. You have to pay a fine if you come late to pick up your kid. And the number of people who came late doubled. And that's because before, what had been a moral decision, am I being fair to the teacher so they don't have to hang around, suddenly became an economic decision. And I'm happy to pay the money to come late. So what had been a relationship turns into a transaction. What had been a moral responsibility, a utilitarian choice. The moral switch is turned off, and that can happen to us, and we can get morally disengaged. So we live in a culture after 60 years of individualism where we're detached from another and selfishness is rationalized. And we find ourselves, a lot of us, living lives that are basically not sustainable. And the people I admire most, they get their career and sometimes they get to the top of their first mountain and they just find it unsatisfying. It wasn't really all they expected. Or they fail, they're not on a mountain. Or something happens that wasn't part of the original plan. They get a cancer scare, they lose a child. And the desires of the first mountain seem unimportant in comparison. And this happened to me. So I start as a writer, which means temperamentally I'm probably reasonably aloof. When I go to journalism schools, I say, if you're at a football game and everybody's doing the wave, and you sit there and don't do the wave, you have the right kind of aloof personality type to be a journalist. You should go do that. And then writers, a lot of the times people go into writing or music or art because they're not naturally convivial at a party, and their art form or their craft is the only way they can really connect. A friend of mine, Chris Wyman, who's a poet, says a certain emotional reserve in one's life becomes a source of great power in one's work. There's a Gary Shandling line, "My friends tell me I have an intimacy problem, but they don't really know me." And so you start with a detached personality, and then you go into a profession where a lot of the time is just spent alone. John Cheever used to work in New York. He had an apartment, I think, on Park Avenue. He would get up in the morning, he would put on a suit and tie, he would ride the elevator down to the basement where he had an office, he'd take off his suit and tie, he'd write in his boxers, at 12:30 he'd put back on the suit and tie, take the elevator up and make himself lunch. That's the day. And so that's solitary. And then when you succeed, weirdly, it gets even more solitary. My last book did well financially, and I was on book tour for 99 days. And in one stretch of that period, I counted that I ate 42 meals consecutively alone at an airport, airplane, or hotel. And when you do that, you're traveling, you're detached from all your moorings, and you're really off the rails. I remember around that time I saw a picture of Britney Spears kind of going crazy and shaving off all her hair. And I was like, yeah, I could do that. I'm there. I could do that. And so you just get detached, and that can go on for decades. You can desire the wrong things. Reputation more than connection. I realized I idolized time over people. I had to be productive, so I always had this clock in my head, got to keep moving. And relationships just take time. And so if you value productivity over relationship, you're going to find yourself a little detached. You're going to find yourself communicating on TV at the NewsHour, but not communicating to those around you, to your friends, not showing up for them, evasion, avoiding conflict. Real relationship is complete honesty in a context of complete love, and that's a skill. And so I went into the Valley in early 2013. The wages of sin are sin. My kids had left off to go to college. My marriage was ending and had ended, and I was humiliated by that failed commitment. I was a conservative, but today's conservatism is not my kind of conservatism, and so I'd lost my attachments to that movement. I was living in an apartment and not entertaining. And so if you open the drawer where my silverware should have been, there were just Post-it notes. And if you open the drawer where I should have plates, it was just stationery and envelopes. Because for a lot of people, workaholism is a very luring way to avoid any emotional problem. And so I had a lot of weekday friends where I could have lunch and talk about politics, but I had no weekend friends, which are the real kind of friends. So I was just detached. And the weird thing is, as I was going into that detached, isolated mode and suffering for it, a lot of Americans were doing that too. One of the things, the secrets of my career is that when something's happening to me, it's often happening to a lot of people. I say I'm an average person with above average communication skills. And so we went into and are currently in a crisis of isolation, a crisis of solidarity, an age of separation. 35% of Americans over 45 are chronically lonely. About half Americans say no one knows them well. Only 8% of Americans report having important conversations with their neighbors. The fastest growing political party is unaffiliated. The fastest growing religious movement is unaffiliated. Since 1999, the suicide rate is up 30%. Among teenagers over the last 12 years, the suicide rate is up 70%. 45,000 Americans kill themselves every year. Suicide is just a proxy for loneliness. 72,000 Americans die from opiate addiction. CDC tells us that life expectancy is declining, not rising, which is unheard of in an advanced nation. The only other time in American history where life expectancy has declined was 1917 and 1918, where we had a world war and a flu pandemic. We don't trust each other anymore. If you ask people a generation ago, do you trust the institutions of your society? 80% said yes. Now it's 22%. If you asked, do you trust your neighbors? Are your neighbors trustworthy? A generation ago, it was 60%. Now it's down to 32% and 18% of millennials. The younger you go, the more distrusting people are. And then it's amazing to me, given all we know about the brain, that mental health problems are rising, not falling. Depression rates are rising radically, not falling. College mental health facilities are swamped. And a lot of people just feel they're adrift. Nietzsche had a saying, if you have a why to live for, you can endure anyhow. If you know what your purpose is, you can handle the setbacks. But if you don't know what the purpose is, the setbacks are crumbling. And you have what I call a telos crisis, a loss of sense of purpose, which leads to this medieval concept, acedia, which is the loss of desire, a loss of desire in your own life. Your life is over here, but your desires are over there. I had a friend named Casey Gerald who was in a job interview, and at the end of the interview, he turned around and asked the interviewer the question, and he said, what would you do if you weren't afraid? And the woman started crying, because if she wasn't afraid, she wouldn't be doing HR for that company. And I asked that of my students, and every class, 2 or 3 say, if I wasn't afraid, I'd drop out of Yale. But they don't want to give up the brand. And so we're in a sense where we don't treat each other well, and we're in this valley as a nation. And so I've spent the last 6 years thinking, how do you get out of valleys? Both the personal valley and the national valley. And the fortunate thing is, the Greeks had a saying, you suffer your way to wisdom. You learn a lot in the valley. I think since the election of 2016, we've learned a lot about our country. And when I was in the valley, I learned a lot and had some realizations. The first realization is that freedom sucks. Political freedom's good, economic freedom's pretty good, social freedom sucks. All my married friends were calling me and projecting their fantasies onto me. Oh, it'd be so great to be unattached. It was terrible. The unattached man is the adrift man. The unattached man is the unremembered man because he's not really committed to anything. Freedom is not an ocean you want to swim in, it's a river you want to swim through so you can plant yourself somewhere on the other side. The second realization I had was that you can be broken or you can be broken open. And some people, when something bad happens to them, the death of a loved one, the loss of a job, something else, they get broken. They make themselves invulnerable, their life gets smaller and more afraid, they lash out with anger and grievance and resentment toward the world, and they usually cause pain to those around them. There's a good saying that pain that is not transformed gets transmitted. Pass it along. Broken people turn tribal. We've left people in our society naked and alone, and they do what their evolutionary roots tell them to do, which is they revert to tribe. And tribe seems like a way to build bonding, to build community, but really it's the dark twin of community. Community is based on mutual love. We love our town together, we love a cause together, we love our faith together. Tribalism is based on mutual hatred. We hate the same other. So it's always us, them, friend, enemy, distrust, scarcity mentality, erect barriers, build walls. Other people get broken open. Suffering is an interruption of everyday life, and it reminds you you're not the person you thought you were. The theologian from the 50s, Paul Tillich, said those moments of suffering carve through what you thought was the floor of the basement of your soul and reveal a cavity below, and they carve through that and reveal a cavity below. And so you see deeper into yourself than you ever did before, and you become more centered in yourself. The desires of the ego go away, and what you see are two things. You see the desires of your heart first. I read about a guy not long ago who bought a house with a bamboo stand by the driveway. And he chopped down the bamboo, and he took an axe to the root system because he wanted to get rid of it. He dug a hole, put plant poison throughout it, 3 feet of gravel, 6 inches of cement. 2 years later, little shoot of bamboo come up through the cement. And in my view, we all have that. We all have our desires. If you look at kids at a school play, they're just fervent with desire. And what the heart desires more than anything else is fusion with another. The kind of fusion that Louis de Bernier described in his book, Captain Corelli's Mandolin. He is an old guy in that book talking to his daughter about his relationship with his late wife. And the old guy says, love itself is what is left over when being in love is burned away. And this is both an art and a fortunate accident. Your mother and I had it. We had roots that grew towards each other underground, and when all the pretty blossoms had fallen from our branches, we found out that we were one tree and not two. And that's the sort of merger we want. And so when you're in suffering, you get in touch with that. The second thing you get in touch with is your yearning soul. Now, I don't ask you to believe in God or not believe in God. You can come here on Saturday, somebody can help you. But I do ask you to believe that there's some piece of you that has no shape, size, color, or weight, but it gives you infinite value and dignity. And that rich and successful people don't have more of this than poor and less successful people. That slavery is wrong because it's an attempt to obliterate another person's soul. That rape isn't just an attack on a bunch of physical molecules, it's an attempt to obliterate a soul. And what our soul gives us is moral responsibility. Tigers don't have moral responsibility, but we do. It gives us equality. Our brains are not equal, our legs are not equal, our bodies are not equal, but our souls are equal. And what it gives us is this yearning for righteousness. I've never met somebody who didn't want to live a righteous life, didn't want to lead a life full of meaning and purpose. Even people who do very bad things have some rationalization for why what they did was actually good. And what the soul yearns for is connection to some transcendent ideal and service to that ideal, and then tasting that ideal's realization and feeling the kind of joy that Rabbi Wolf Kellman described when he marched at Selma with Martin Luther King. He wrote later, "We felt connected in song to the transcendental, the ineffable. We felt triumph and celebration. We felt that things change for the good and nothing is congealed forever. That was the warmest, most transcendental spiritual experience. Meaning and purpose and mission were beyond exact words." That's what the soul yearns for. And so I think you touch those deeper desires in the valley, the desires that are deeper than the ego desires. And that leads to the third realization, which is something I read from Einstein. He said, your problem is not going to be solved at the same level of consciousness at which it was created. You have to expand your consciousness and have a different sort of mind. And so what do you do? Well, one thing you do is you talk to your friends and have deeper conversations than you ever had before. You throw yourself on the friends. But sometimes you have to go out alone and stand in the pain, in the wilderness. There's a story in the rabbinic tradition of Moses was being a shepherd in his period in the wilderness, and one of his lambs ran away into the wilderness running like a gazelle. Little lambs usually don't run like gazelles, but this one did. And he ran deeper into the wilderness, and Moses had to go find him and did catch him eventually. And the rabbis teach us the lamb was Moses himself. He had to go deeper into the wilderness to find himself. And when you're deep in the wilderness, the first thing that happens is time changes. It gets slower, and you're connected. The trees don't really care about your lifetime. Second, if you're the sort of person who's performing for others all the time, there's no one to perform for. And so the ego is irrelevant. And as Belden Lane says, it's only then that you're capable of being loved. And the third thing you discovered when things quiet down is that there's some inner tenderness there in you. I have a friend who said that when her first daughter was born, she realized she loved her more than evolution required. And I've always loved that phrase because it suggests there's some deep tenderness and a capacity to care that is actually miraculous about us. Penguins are really loyal to each other, but they don't have the kind of love that we have. Andy Dillard said, if you go down to the depths of the violence and terror of which psychology has warned us, if you ride your monsters down, you locate the substrate, the unified field, our complex and inexplicable caring for each other. And I love that last sentence, our complex and inexplicable caring for each other. If you, in the wilderness, you go down into a highway into self, and you go right out of self, yearning for attachment to others and attachment to a cause. And you realize that life is bigger and more enchanted and more interconnected than you ever could have imagined on your first mountain. You realize we live lives too small, that it's like we're all competing for space around a sun lamp, where if we just stepped outside, there's real sunshine. And so when you make these realizations, you're ready for your second mountain, because you become a slightly different person. The tricky part is, in my experience, you can't climb out of the valley on your own. Somebody has to reach down and pull you out. And I had a lucky break in 2013, which was I was invited over to the house of a couple named Kathy and David. And they had a kid who was in the DC public schools who had a friend who didn't have a place to stay. So they said, well, James can stay with us. And then James had a friend, and that kid had a friend, and that kid had a friend. And by the time I go there in 2013, there are 30 kids around the dinner table and 15 sleeping around the house. And I walk in there, and I reach out my hand to shake a kid's hand. He says, we don't really shake hands here. We hug here. And I'm not the huggiest guy on the face of the earth, but every Thursday I've been coming back and hugging all those kids for the last 6 years. And what we do is we have a dinner. We eat the same thing every Thursday night, chicken and black rice, and we throw our stuff on the table. Sometimes it's good stuff, passed the GED, got a job at a barber school. Sometimes it's tough stuff, depression, pregnancy. One woman's kidney failed, and David, the father figure, gave her one of his. And I took my daughter there once, and she said, that's the warmest place I've ever been. And what the kids have is a complete intolerance of social distance. They completely force you to show up in full relationship and to be completely intimate with them. They turn to you like flowers, beaming love and demanding it in return. And they sort of coach you into being a different sort of person. And the good news is that this community, which is called AOK, is not unique. There are people like this building community, building connection, building relationship all around the country. About a year and a half ago, I started a project at the Aspen Institute called Weave, the Social Fabric Project. And our supposition was that social isolation, as I said, was the core problem, but that all around the country at local communities, people were fixing it. We wanted to know, what are they doing and how can we nationalize their effect? So we've spent the last year traveling and meeting people like this, and they're everywhere. You go to Wilkesboro, North Carolina, the town of 2,000, you find 75 amazing people right away. We met a woman named Aisha Butler in Chicago. She lived in a tough neighborhood called Englewood, which is violent. She just was going to move out. And she looked across the street as the moving vans were coming, and she saw two little girls playing in an empty lot with broken bottles. She turns to her husband and says, "We're not leaving. We're not going to be just another family who left that." So she Googles volunteer in Englewood, and then she starts volunteering, and now she runs the big community organization there, just weaving the fabric of that community back together. A lot of the people we've met have had horrible valleys. Spent a day with a woman named Sarah in Athens, Ohio, who was out antiquing with her mom, and she came back on a Sunday evening and found that her husband had killed their two kids and himself. And now she runs a free pharmacy. She helps mom through violence. She teaches at Ohio University. She told me, "I grew from this experience because I was angry. I was going to fight back against what he tried to do to me by making a difference in the world. See, he didn't kill me. My response to him is, whatever you meant to do to me, screw you, you're not going to do it to me." These people have what Richard Rohr calls a bright sadness. They're very loving and giving, but they've seen the bottom of the world. And they just live by a different value system than is prevalent in our mainstream culture. They have moral motivation. They're not interested in money and celebrity. They just want to be in right relationship with others and serving some good cause. They have vocational certitude. They know why they're planted on this earth. They're somewheres, not anywheres. They've picked a local area, a geographic spot, and they're going to defend it. There was a guy I met in Youngstown, Ohio, who just held up a sign that says, "Defend Youngstown," and that's how he started his life. They believe in radical mutuality. We're all equal, we're all broken, we're all doing this together. Mostly, they're just deeply relational. If people got into Stanford on the basis of being really good at relationships, these people would all be at Stanford. And what they do is they reach down and they grab people out. One of the organizations I admire is up in Ontario called Roots of Empathy, and it's run by a woman named Mary Gordon. And what they do is they take infants and kids and moms, put them into 8th grade classrooms, and then the infant crawls around, and the students have to guess what's going on in the infant's mind. It's how they teach theory of mind. How do I put myself in another person's shoes? And they were doing it at one school, and there was a kid named Darren who was bigger than everybody else because he'd been held back 2 years. He'd been through the foster care system. And he asked the mom if he could hold the baby. And she was nervous because he looked so violent, or big, potentially violent. But she gave him, and he was great with the baby. He nestled the baby in his chest, and then he gave it back to the mom and started asking questions about parenthood. And the final question was, if nobody has ever loved you, do you think you could be a good father? And so what Mary Gordon is doing is reaching into the valley and pulling out the Darrens. And so being around these people is, you see a whole different way of life. Spiritual heroes. In my view, society changes when a small group of people find a better way to live and the rest of us copy them. And they've found a better way to live with different values, slightly different lifestyle. And you don't have to be heroic like Mary Gordon or like the woman who lost her family. You can just invite somebody over for dinner who was your neighbor. You could have a relationship with somebody completely like yourself, but it's that value shift. That's the difference between the first and second mountain. The first mountain is about building up the ego and defining the self. The second mountain is about shedding the ego and losing the self. The first mountain is about acquisition. The second mountain is about contribution. The first mountain is elitist, you're climbing up. The second mountain is egalitarian, you're planting yourself down. And some people really are radically changed when they make this transition. They switch their job, they do everything differently. I ran into a woman in New Orleans who was driving one day, a healthcare executive. She turned to her right, saw some kids who looked terrified, age 11 and 10. They lifted a gun and shot her in the face. It was a gang initiation ritual. And she recovered and realized, well, I was a victim, but so were they. So she quit her job as a healthcare executive and then went off to work with gang members. But most people don't change. They stay in the same job, in the same marriage, in the same life, but their attitude is toward relationship, not toward self. Their ultimate allegiance is to that. And it's easy to say, I live for relationship, but it's really hard to actually do it. It takes a moral orientation, and it just takes practical knowledge. In my book, I throw as much practical knowledge that I heard from others out there. Like, for example, living in a relationship in marriage is hard. And so they say you should never go to bed mad, but actually sometimes you should just go to bed. You're just tired, you'll feel better in the morning, you'll wake waffles. Just go to bed. Sometimes wives have the urge to bitch to somebody about their husband's bad behavior recently. And so the rule is bitch to his mother and not to yours, because his mother will forgive him, yours never will. And so there are just basic rules of living for relationship in the right way. But it's that living for relationship that is actually a subtle but powerful shift. I read in a book about a guy named Luke who was a hospital janitor. And Luke cleaned the rooms in the hospital and the floor. And one room he cleaned every day was a kid who was in a coma he wasn't coming out of. And his father sat vigil with him. And Luke cleaned the room every day. But one day he cleaned the room and the father was out getting a smoke. And later in the day, the father came to Luke and said, "You didn't clean my kid's room." And the first mountain response is to think, well, my job is cleaning rooms. In that case, you say to the father, "I did clean the room, but you were out getting a smoke." The second mountain response is to think, my job is actually comforting patients and their families, in which case I should go in and clean the room a second time so he can see me clean it. And that's what Luke did. And so it's, what is your ultimate orientation? And the final difference between the first and second mountain is your ultimate goal. On the first mountain, we're shooting for happiness. And happiness is when you feel the self expand. You win a victory, you get a promotion, you do your job well, your team wins the Super Bowl, Steph Curry scores 40 points, and you feel yourself swell up with happiness. Joy tends to involve some loss of self. It's when the barriers that separate people fade away and you feel fused together, a mother and daughter in relationship. You're out in the woods and you feel transcendent with nature, and you forget yourself, and suddenly you're lifted and feel joy, something transcendent. And so the final thing I'll say tonight is that I've collected joy, not personal, but experiences of joy. And you realize that joy comes in layers. Sometimes you feel joy at work. We experience that as flow. There's a great scene in Anna Karenina where the great character, Levin, is cutting grass, and he feels part of the scythe, and he just loses self-consciousness, and he just works perfectly. Then there's moments of collective effervescence, when you're out with your friend, and through some ritual, you lose yourself. In 1999, the novelist Zadie Smith was out at a nightclub with her friends looking for her handbag, when suddenly she heard the hip-hop artist Q-Tip coming over the sound system. And she wrote, "A rail-thin man with enormous eyes reached across a sea of bodies for my hand. He kept asking me the same thing over and over again, 'Are you feeling it?' I was. My ridiculous heels were killing me. I was terrified I might die, yet I felt simultaneously overwhelmed with delight that Can I Kick It should happen to be playing at this precise moment in the history of the world, and was now morphing into Smells Like Teen Spirit. I took the man's hand, the top of my head flew away, we danced and danced, we gave ourselves over to joy." Third layer is emotional joy. This is when you're really with someone you love, and you get overcome by it. Dorothy Day is one of my heroes, fought poverty in the 20th century. She realized before her daughter was born that all the accounts of childbearing she'd ever read were written by guys. And so she wrote an essay 40 minutes after giving her birth to her daughter, which has a lot of violence of pain of childbirth, but it ends with this passage. "If I had written the greatest book, composed the greatest symphony, and carved the most exquisite figure, I could not have felt the more exalted creator than I did when they placed my child in my arms. No human creature could receive or contain so vast a flood of love and joy as I felt after the birth of my child. And with this came a need to worship and to adore, just overcome with joy." And so these are all ascending stages of joy. To me, the highest stage is moral joy. All the other stages, joy comes and goes as a minute. And they come and go sometimes as a minute where you think you're peering deeply into reality. But some people are just joyous all the time. They really do live their life as a gift. They give themselves away. Helen Keller said, "There is joy in self-forgetfulness. So I try to make the light in other people's eyes my sun, the music in other people's ears my symphony, the smile on other people's lips my happiness." It's oriented toward that. I've been working with Weave. I've gotten a chance to work with Yo-Yo Ma. That guy just radiates joy all the time. I was seated at a Washington function next to the Dalai Lama one day. And he didn't say anything profound, which was a disappointment to me. But he just radiated joy the whole time. He laughs for no apparent reason. And I'm sitting next to him, and he would laugh, and I wanted to be polite, so I would laugh, and then he would laugh, and I would laugh. And I had nothing to say to the guy, so he had a little canvas Dalai Lama bag. And I said, you have any candy in the bag? And he starts pulling out the stuff in the bag, and it's basically everything you get on the first class cabin of an international flight. It's like a little razor, a little iPad. But he radiates joy. Jeffrey Boyle, who founded Homeboy Industries in LA, says joy is moving from the cramped self-preoccupation to just compassion. And so what I've tried to paint is a shift in values. American culture shifts from time to time. In the 1950s, we were pretty collective, pretty communal, and we found that eventually stifling. And so we broke out and we had an era that was about, I'm free to be myself. And it happened here in the Summer of Love. It happened around the country, and it had a lot of good things that came out of that era that was individualistic, that says I'm free to be myself. We had a lot more creativity. The food is a lot better. We had the civil rights movement, we had feminism, we had the Silicon Valley creativity, which is sort of a rebel, disruptive creativity. But we've had 60 years of hyper-individualism, and we've become detached from one another, bitter and alienated. And so we need a cultural shift. And to me, these weavers, they are leading us to a better future. They're a movement that doesn't know it's a movement. But the rest of us just need to shift our values a little. Shift from the first mountain mentality to the second mountain mentality. And Americans and people in general are ingenious. We figure stuff out. And I have every confidence we'll figure it out. We just need to make a cultural shift. And I've written this book as a small gesture to push us a little in that direction. Thank you. Thank you. And I think we still have some time for questions. I hope that only 80% of them are about the Mueller report. So I think there are mic runners here and here. It's hard for me to see, but please make your questions long and rambling with no question at the end.
So question over here to your left, or your right, rather.
Okay.
Mr. Brooks, it's always a pleasure to hear you speak. Thank you so much. If the next president decided to create a job called the Secretary of Character and wisely offered it to you, what would be your first order of business nationally?
It's funny because Donald Trump asked me to do that for his. You know, I don't think, one of the things government can't do is provide care. We can only give that to each other. But the government could provide platforms where care happens. And one of the things, you know, one of the ways I would do everything I can to connect us back together and to really emphasize the moral community that we are. There are a couple things I do. One is national service, just so people from Marin could beat somebody from Mississippi. That would be good for 2 years. Second, we need to find a national story. We had a story, frankly, it was the Exodus story. We left oppression, we crossed the ocean, we came to the promised land. And that was the Jewish immigrant story, it was the civil rights movement story, it was the founder's story. They want to put Moses on the Great Seal of the United States. But I tell that story to young people and they look at me like I'm crazy. They just don't buy that story anymore. And so somehow we have to find a national unifying story that includes all the voices that have been left out of our story so far. And that creating a national narrative strikes me as really important. And then the third thing and final thing is I've really come to believe that the neighborhood is the unit of change here. We sometimes think if we can save one individual at a time, that'll be good. But as a friend of mine in Shreveport says, you can't only clean the part of the pool you're swimming in. Because we're so contagious creatures, you have to create neighborhood by neighborhood. You have to create change at that level. There's a great economist, Raj Chetty, who points out two very demographically similar neighborhoods are South Central LA and Compton. In South Central, at one point, 42% of the young men of a certain age were in prison. In Compton, it was 6%. What's the difference? One neighborhood has a lot of institutions that can guide people through life, the other doesn't. So you really have to take one neighborhood at a time and just throw everything you have at it. So to me, localizing a lot of that power and giving neighborhoods responsibility for themselves is the way you get them to work together. Rabbi Sachs points out that in Genesis, the creation of the universe is covered in 9 verses. In Exodus, the creation of the tabernacle goes on for hundreds and hundreds of verses. A lot of us had to sat through all those parsha. Why is that? It's because a community is a group of people who build something together. And in Exodus, the Jews are coming together as a people, and they're building something together. And we have to get neighborhoods building things together under the supposition we are enough. We can take care of our own problems.
The next question is in the front.
Okay.
Hi, thank you for a great talk. This question may reflect on me more than it reflects on you, but I'm wondering how you connect your current view of the world and what you want to see change with your historical conservatism and your work for the National Review. I mean, it seems like for me, it seems like a real shift in your perspective on the world.
Yeah, I would say yes or no. The thing that really changed me was when I was a freshman in college, I was forced to read a book I hated called The Reflections on the Revolution in France by Edmund Burke. And that book is about 2 things. One, it's about epistemological modesty. The world is really complicated. Be careful how you change it because it's so complicated beyond what you can imagine. Second, respect the moral coherence of the culture you inherited. And so there's a great emphasis that culture shapes history and communal culture shapes history. So that sort of has always been my intellectual foundation, that and Alexander Hamilton, who's a Puerto Rican hip-hop star from the Heights. There is some strain. But the other thing, when I was working at the Wall Street Journal and National Review, I was much too molded by economic categories, by economic thinking, by the thinking that we are rational individuals who seek self-interest and who seek to individually maximize our self-interest. All these weavers, they don't do that at all. And so I think economics and social science has given us a false view of human nature, and I bought into that. I also, and before the last few years, even my last book, in Road to Character, I thought character formation was individual. It's something you do inside yourself. And I no longer believe that. I think you form your character by falling in love with the right thing and then serving the things you love outside yourself. I remember when my eldest kid was born, he had a super low APGAR score and didn't know what was happening. I took him up to the intensive care unit. And I remember thinking that night, if he only lives 30 minutes, would it be worth a lifetime of grief for his mother and I? And if you had asked me before he was born, I would have said, no way. But after he was born, it was obviously. His life is of infinite value and dignity. And it's infinite. And so when you have your first kid, especially, you become aware of a level of commitment you never imagined beforehand. And then you sort of want to serve that kid. You want to make promises to it. You might feel like playing golf or going for a run, but you push the kid in the baby carriage. You become slightly less selfish because of what you love. And so my view of character formation is much more communal. So I've moved left economically because I'm much more communal about it. So that part is a shift.
This question up here to your right.
Okay.
Good evening and thank you. I've been wrestling with a question that it occurs to me you might be able to assist with. Setting aside financial corruption, at what point can you define a line or a category where a politician's actions cross over into evil? And I'm excluding the obvious Hitlers and Stalins, but when do a politician's actions really reflect evil.
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 Yeah, that's.
I'm not
Yeah.
using names right now, but I'm just trying to figure out when can one say that with some moral authority, perhaps.
It's a really good question. Of course, it all depends on the question of evil. And I guess, to me, evil is, and sin in general, is disordered love. Loving the wrong thing in a different order. And so if a friend tells you a secret at a dinner party, and you blab it to your friends, you're putting your love of popularity above your love of friendship, and that's a sin. And so to me, I guess the more I think about it, you start out with virtue, and there's just, none of us have that. And then it's just a continuum. And really the question you're asking is, when do you draw a line and say, that's just evil? That you've gotten so far out on this end, we're talking Rwanda genocide, we're talking the Shoah, we're talking Stalin, we're talking Mao. I wake up daily appalled by our president. He's given me a reason to live at some level. And I do think he's ripping apart the fabric of our society, destroying the norms. And so I remember the first Republican debate, he'd already attacked people for looking bad, for having facelifts. And then he turned to Rand Paul and said, I'm not going to attack you for your looks, but I got a lot to work with there. And I remember thinking, I'm seeing a presidential candidate talk this way, and when you take away all the etiquette and the civility and the norms, life is just dog eat dog. And that's sort of what's happened to our society, part because we're being ripped apart at the top. So is that evil? I would say it's wrong. But somehow I hesitate to use the word evil, I'm really thinking out loud here, because it suggests somebody is irredeemable. And I would hate to think that about anybody. And maybe some people are irredeemable, people don't recover from narcissism, but somehow making that label, and frankly making it a label to somebody who's supported by 42% of our fellow countrymen, somehow I hesitate to go there. But again, it's a very good question I'll think upon more.
Thank you. We have time for 3 more questions. The next question is on your left.
Okay. So like many people here, I'm a longtime NewsHour groupie and have listened to you for countless years. And I'm so interested to know whether it's thinking about the current events and putting them in the context of our society and history in the way that you do, combined with all of the research and facts and figures, or all the ideas you've talked about for this book and other books. What is your process, and has it changed at all since 2013, where you kind of take the time to sit and think and then synthesize and sort of do everything that you do? How do you actually make that happen?
Well, now I just wait for divine revelation. I always have, now these days, I mean, my books have gotten more spiritual as I've gotten older, and more emotional and more moral. My basic view is that we're over-politicized and under-moralized. We talk too much about politics and not about relationship, about how you do gratitude, how you do forgiveness, the things that are really the substance of our lives. But my process actually has stayed pretty much the same. I read a lot. Before I took this job at Weave, my median shaving time was 5:30 p.m. I would get up, I'd start reading and writing, and I wouldn't have to go anywhere outside, so I'd shave and shower at 5:30 and go out to dinner. And what I do is I read books and I mark them up, the parts that I think are really valuable, and then I go off to FedEx office and I Xerox. And I Xerox off the parts, and I've got drawers and drawers of sheets of books where I find something valuable. Somebody said what writers are is we're beggars who tell other beggars where we found bread. So if I find a quote that means something to me, I'm hoping it'll mean something to you. And so I have hundreds of pages of this. And what I do, let me start with the column. For each column, I've got about 200 pages of notes and references. And so I mark it up, and on my living room floor, I just take all the pieces of information and I organize them into piles. And the pile is a paragraph in my column. And there might be, it's only 850 words, but there might be 14 piles stretched across the carpet of the floor. And so my process of writing is not sitting at a keyboard typing, it's crawling around on my hands and knees organizing my piles. And I tell my students, though they don't listen, by the time you start typing, your paper should be 80% done. Because it's all about structure and traffic management. And when it's a book, there are literally thousands of piles. And so it's an elaborate structure. And what I find I don't know if anybody else feels this way, it takes me a long time to find the structure of the book. And when I end up with 4 years later is always simplicity, the simplest possible structure. And I always think, well, why didn't I do this first? But it takes a lot of work to get to simplicity. And so to me, it's me writing the piles. And frankly, when I'm crawling around and thoughts are coming to me and I'm writing stuff on Post-it notes, that's the best part of my job. That's when it's all coming together. That's the creative part. But it takes a very thick carpet because my knees hurt more than they used to.
Question up here to your right.
Besides your books, what should we be reading?
Oh, good question. I'm always reading like 9 books. I'm reading a great biography of John Updike right now. Let's see. Well, I mentioned Jonathan Sacks. He has a great book called The Home We Build Together. And it's really about how to build national community. It's about what covenant means. One of my favorite descriptions of faith is written by a guy named Christian Wyman, who teaches with me at Yale. He's a poet. And he says, if faith was supposed to make me happy, I can tell you it's not working for me. And he says that faith is, you just have these moments. You don't feel God all the time, but occasionally you do. And then you try to stay faithful to those moments. And he's just got a beautiful, very realistic, very gritty description of what faith looks like when it's mixed with doubt. And so that comes to mind. I really should have a better answer. A book that's come important to me called Community by Peter Block, that it's inspired a lot of my weave work. And he's really an expert on what makes a community. He's been doing this his whole life. And he really emphasizes the importance of organizing conversations. That power is created when you have a new conversation and you bring people who are formerly outside the conversation into the conversation. And each conversation should be a model of the community you want to build. And he just talks very practically how you build a community. And then I guess among my favorite books, my favorite novel is a cliche, Anna Karenina. I went back and read a lot of Saul Bellow, and he holds up. I recommend his books. And then one of my favorite, I'm really freestyling right now, but one of my favorite memoirs was Teddy Roosevelt, Edmund Morrison's first volume of his Teddy Roosevelt biography. Some books are just stunningly beautiful. So these are random books. I should have a better answer for that question. I apologize. As one professor of mine said, you can either read books or write books. You can't do both. That's wrong, by the way.
This will be our last question. It's in the front.
Hi, how are you? I understand the first mountain. I've been up the first mountain. I am approaching the second mountain. But what I was most intrigued about was your explanation of the Dalai Lama and the joy that he has, and about the weavers and about the love that they're able to express and to share with you. So my question to you is, are these people on the third mountain or are they on the second mountain?
Yeah.
And here's your next book.
Yeah, that'll be the third mountain. I would say, the mountain thing is just a metaphor for 2 different moral systems. The first one built on self and ego and individualism, the second one built on relationship and self-giving. And so you think practically, how do you move to one to the other? I do think sometimes I think you have to go through that inner transformation where the ego is blasted away. And I do think moments of suffering sometimes needed to do that, though sometimes people are loved so lavishly, they move to the second mountain. And some people are just raised in a spiritual home, so they do their second mountain first. I have a friend, Rabbi Meir Soloveichik, And he's a part of the Soloveitchik family of rabbis. They've been doing this for like 700 years. And he is as joyous as the day is long. He just radiates happiness. He's got 8 zillion kids. He works at a synagogue in New York called Portuguese and Spanish Synagogue. The synagogue has been around 350 years. He's the 10th rabbi. They live a long time over there. So he was just steeped in moral culture going back hundreds of years, including his great uncle Joseph Soloveitchik. But I think most of us need to be blasted out of the culture. And then I think we need to be seized by a problem. Very often you don't. The people that especially the weavers, they didn't set out to do what they thought they were going to do. Sometimes a problem just leapt in front of them. And like Viktor Frankl, when he was in Auschwitz, he realized, the wrong question to ask is, what do I want to do with my life? Because it wouldn't be being in Auschwitz. The right question is to ask, what is life asking of me? What's my responsibility here? And so he said, I'm a psychiatrist in Auschwitz, I'll study suffering. And so most of the people I really admire, some problem stumbles across them. And they say, it's my moral responsibility to respond to this. And so the people on their second mountain have a problem-finding mentality. And they go out to the places where problems are so they can be seized. And it could come in the form of a kid to mentor or a cause that you care about. I have a friend named Fred Wertheimer who's probably in his upper 70s. He bombards me every day with emails about the problems of campaign spending, corruption. And I really don't care about the problem as much as he does. But I can't tell him that and unsubscribe because it would be like telling him I didn't like his children. I mean, he loves his problem. And as a result, he's wholeheartedly devoted to it. And so it's about quieting that and then just finding that problem and saying, yeah, this is what I'm going to do. I once told something similar to this to a college student, and she said, I haven't suffered enough. Maybe I should go out and find some suffering. And I said, don't worry, it'll come to you. And I think it's those moments, again, it's all so subtle. It's like that aesthetic sense, the moral call, the moment when you know this is why I was put on this earth for this freakish circumstance. And often there just takes patient waiting. And then the final thing I'll say, Nietzsche said, to find your true calling, write down the 4 moments when you felt your life was most beautiful. And then try to draw a line through them. And if you can find thematic consistency in those 4 moments, you've found the law of your very self. And I'll leave you with that. Thank you.
Thank you.